A sharp, sudden rattle against the second-story glass. It is not the wind. The wind is a broad, heavy hand against the brickwork of the terrace, sweeping off the docks and curling down the narrow alleys. This sound is deliberate. It is small, concentrated, and entirely out of place in the dead hours of the night. A handful of dried peas striking the frost-rimed pane of an upper bedroom window. They hit with the rhythm of breath, falling away into the soot-stained snow below. Down on the cobbles, standing in a darkness so absolute it feels heavy on the shoulders, a figure lowers a slender, hollow tube, waits for the faint glow of a struck match inside the room, and moves to the next door. She wakes the world to work, and the world wakes without her name. It is a paradox of the industrial age, a profession built to end the very rest this channel seeks to provide, a trade paid for in copper pennies, existing only in the bitter, freezing hours before the sun has even considered rising. In the press records and surviving photographs of early 20th century Bethnal Green, her name is recorded as Mary Smith. She was one of a quiet army of men and women across the industrial map of Britain who held the title of knocker-up, armed with long bamboo poles meant to reach the upper windows of mill workers, or, in Mary's case, a simple rubber tube in a pocket full of dried peas. They were the human mechanisms that started the great engines of the era. Before the factory whistle could blow, before the looms could rattle and the furnaces could roar, the knocker-up had to walk the freezing stone of the terraced streets, ensuring that the shift was never missed. They were the clock, long before the clock belonged to the household. They held the fragile economy of the working poor in their freezing hands. For a few pence a week, they guaranteed that a man would not lose his day's wage or his job to the unforgiving factory gate. They walked miles in the pitch black, memorizing hundreds of windows, keeping a ledger of sleeping faces in their minds. But as the miles of dark cobblestone wore on and the damp cold seeped through worn leather boots, a quieter mystery remained in the empty streets behind them. If the city relied entirely on the knocker-up to pull it from the dark, who woke her? And when the cheap, mass-produced clock finally arrived on the mantelpieces of the working class, what happened to the woman who had been the clock? The answer lies in the frost of the unlit streets and in the quiet ledgers of a time governed by the mill gate. Let the modern room fade, settle into the dark. This is the dark reality of the human alarm clock and of the long pre-dawn street that no one, in the end, chose to remember. Welcome back. Step out of the cold and into the quiet. If you are here, it is because the night has grown long and sleep is taking its time finding you. That is entirely all right. You are in the right place. Tonight, we are stepping into a very specific kind of darkness. Not the dark of the wilderness or the deep ocean, but the practical, freezing dark of the industrial terrace street. We are walking with the people who sold their own rest so that others might survive the day. The knocker-uppers. It is a strange thing to seek calm by listening to the story of those whose entire livelihood depended on interrupting sleep, but there is a deep, settling peace in looking back at the heavy lifting of the past, at the quiet resilience of a life lived in the shadows of the mill towns. Before we begin our long walk over the cobblestones, I will just say this. If this kind of quiet history brings you a sense of rest, leaving a like helps a few more people find their way here in the dark. That is all. Tonight's journey will take us through the freezing hours before dawn. We will start in the morning the factory made, where the gentle, loose tolling of the parish bell was abruptly replaced by the unforgiving discipline of the factory gate. We will meet Mary Smith and the record, looking closely at the most documented figure of this lost trade and the tools she used to stir the sleeping East End. We will map the route and the register, untangling the intricate mental ledgers and unseen territories held solely in the minds of the wakers. We will ask the quiet question of who wakes the waker, examining the hidden cost paid by those who could never afford to rely on the service they provided. We will tally the economy of the knock, measuring the few copper pennies that stood between a working family and total destitution. As the frost thickens, we will experience the exile of the pre-dawn street, walking entirely alone on the wrong side of the cold window glass. We will rest in the hours that leave no whistle, sitting with the quiet toll the weather and the solitary work took on the aging body. We will recognize the cast of the necessary but invisible, standing alongside the other forgotten edge workers who kept the industrial gears turning while the polite world dreamed. In the deepest stretch of the route, we will find 3 small mercies, fleeting, undocumented moments of human warmth passed through the window frame. And finally, we will rest with the last knocker remembered, watching the slow, quiet disappearance of the human waker as the brass cogs and winding keys of the cheap mechanical clock took their place on the mantelpiece. The fire is lit, the room is safe. Take a slow, heavy breath. Let's begin. A long, low note bleeds through the heavy, freezing fog. It is not an organic sound. It does not rise like a bird from the wet eaves, nor does it toll with the resonant, fading warmth of a bronze parish bell. It is a sustained, shrieking hum of pressurized steam, pushing its way violently out of a brass valve and carrying across the wet slate roofs of the industrial town. It is the factory whistle. Down on the pavement, the cold radiates upward from the York stone, a deep, pervasive, unyielding chill that works its way through the thin soles of worn leather boots and settles permanently into the bone. The air in the street is thick, carrying the bitter, sulphurous taste of unburned coal and the damp, metallic bite of the nearby river. A single breath caught in the back of the throat turns immediately into a dense white plume in the black air. Whistle, steam, silence. It is 4 o'clock in the morning in the deep midwinter of northern England. The sun will not rise for another 4 hours, yet the street is on the absolute verge of waking. The terraced houses stand in long, unbroken lines of soot-stained brick, pressing closely against the narrow, cobbled roads like fortress walls. Behind the thin, rattling, single-pane glass of the upper windows, thousands of men, women, and children are deep in the heavy, muscular sleep of the utterly exhausted. The dampness of the night clings to the wooden window frames, freezing into delicate fern-like patterns of ice on the inside of the glass. The air in the cramped bedrooms is stale and fiercely cold. Whatever meager warmth was provided by yesterday's hearth fire died out in the grate long before midnight, leaving nothing but pale ash and freezing drafts under the door. To understand the world of the human waker, one must first understand how profoundly the industrial age altered the basic biological rhythm of human existence. For centuries prior, time had been fluid, generous, and largely approximate. Before the great masonry smokestacks rose over the valleys of Lancashire and Yorkshire, before the skies of Manchester turned permanently gray, the day was dictated entirely by the turning of the earth and the arc of the sun. Agricultural time was beautifully loose. It was measured in seasons, in daylight, and in the natural completion of manual tasks. A farmer worked until the field was fully plowed, until the light faded into a deep dusk, or until the weather turned and drove him indoors. In that older world, the only public measure of time was the parish bell tolling from the stone church tower across the open fields. It signaled the rough middle of the morning, the approximate center of the afternoon, and the arrival of the Sabbath rest. Time was a suggestion, a soft, organic rhythm woven seamlessly into the natural world. If a man woke 30 minutes later on a Tuesday than he did on a Monday, the soil did not penalize him.
The steam engine fundamentally destroyed that rhythm. The Industrial Revolution did not simply change what people made with their hands. It changed the very nature of when they were permitted to open their eyes. The power looms, the spinning mules, and the great blast furnaces were ravenous, unsentimental beasts. They did not care if the sun was shining, if the snow was falling, or if a child was sick in a terrace bed. The machines represented heavy capital, and capital demanded a constant, unbroken, relentless rhythm of production. An idle loom cost a mill owner money with every passing second. An empty station at a spinning machine slowed the entire factory floor, creating a bottleneck of cotton and profit. To feed these machines, the mill owners required thousands of human hands to operate in absolute synchrony. And so, a new kind of time was forged. Time was no longer tied to the soft light of the sky. It was tied to the burning of coal. It became precise, rigid, and deeply unforgiving. The ultimate, terrifying symbol of this new mechanical time was the factory gate. Standing at the end of the cobblestone streets, cutting off the mill yard from the town, the gate was a massive structure of wrought iron and heavy timber. It was the absolute arbiter of a working family's livelihood. The gate did not open gently, and it absolutely did not wait. It operated on a strict, mechanical schedule, governed entirely by the overlooker's brass pocket watch. At a precise minute before the shift began, the heavy iron bolt was drawn back. The workers, shivering in their thin wool coats, clutching shawls to their chests, would flood through into the courtyard, their wooden clogs clattering against the paving stones in a deafening, desperate rush. And then, at the exact moment the final whistle stopped blowing, the heavy gate was pulled shut. Iron, wood, lock. To be on the wrong side of the gate when the bolt slid home was an economic disaster. The discipline of the factory floor was absolute, and it was enforced through a ruthless, highly organized system of fines. Beside the heavy entrance hung the shift board, a wooden placard detailing the financial penalties for tardiness painted in stark white lettering. In this new world, time was money, and the owners deducted it directly from the meager, hard-won wages of the poor. If a worker arrived even 5 minutes after the gate closed, they might be locked out in the freezing street until the breakfast break at 8 o'clock, losing a quarter of a day's pay in a single careless morning. In some of the stricter mills, being 10 minutes late resulted in a fine that wiped out the earnings of an entire 12-hour shift. For a family living on the absolute precipice of survival, paying rent by the week and buying stale bread by the single penny, a docked wage was not a mere inconvenience to be brushed off. It meant the fire went unlit on a Sunday. It meant the children went hungry. It meant the landlord's knock became a threat of eviction.
The anxiety of the locked gate permeated the terraced streets, soaking into the brickwork and the bedding. It seeped into the very nature of sleep itself. The industrial worker labored for 12, sometimes 14 hours a day in an environment of deafening mechanical noise, choking white cotton dust, and stifling unnatural heat. When they finally returned to their damp, freezing homes in the dark, their bodies required the deep, restorative, motionless sleep of the physically broken. Yet they could not afford to rest completely. The fear of missing the morning whistle hovered over the bed like a specter in the dark. The interface between this private, desperate need for biological rest and the public, rigid demand of the factory was the bedroom window. The thin pane of cheap glass was the only barrier separating the quiet, freezing dark of the home from the brutal, mechanical reality of the mill. Behind the glass lay the vulnerable, sleeping form of the worker, muscles twitching with the phantom vibrations of the loom. Beyond it lay the wet cobblestones, the iron gate, and the merciless brass pocket watch. In the dead of winter, when the northern sky remained pitch black until nearly 8 in the morning, natural light could not be relied upon to wake a household. The body's internal clock, battered by exhaustion, malnutrition, and sensory overload, would naturally sleep straight through the early hours, craving rest above all else. And this was the era before the mass production of the cheap mechanical alarm clock. In the mid to late 19th century, a reliable spring-driven clock was an expensive luxury. It was an intricate object of polished brass and mahogany that sat squarely on the parlor mantels of the middle class, chiming softly in well-heated rooms. A clock of that caliber was priced far beyond the reach of a mill hand who earned barely a few shillings a week. Their mantelpieces held perhaps a tin tea caddy, a cheap ceramic dog, or nothing at all. They could not buy time. So a profound and terrifying dilemma hung over the industrial city. The great engines of the British Empire required tens of thousands of deeply exhausted people to awake simultaneously in total darkness with absolute, unyielding precision. The economy of the entire nation, the vast wealth of the textile barons and the shipping magnates, depended entirely on these workers rising from their beds and walking through the freezing streets to arrive at the iron gates before they swung shut. Yet there was no affordable machine to wake them. There was no natural light to guide them. There was only the heavy, oppressive silence of the pre-dawn terrace, the biting frost on the glass, and the terrifying threat of the overlooker's ledger. The shift had to be met, the loom had to be manned, the wages had to be secured. Dark, cold, wait. If the mechanical clock had not yet found its way to the mantelpiece of the working poor, and the slow, forgiving parish bell had been violently rendered obsolete by the factory whistle, how did the terraced streets stir themselves from the heavy depths of exhausted sleep? When the margin between survival and starvation was measured in a matter of 5 merciless minutes, who held the terrible responsibility of breaking the silence? Who made sure the gate was never missed?
The sensation begins in the fingers. Inside the deep, worn pocket of a heavy woolen coat, a hand numb from the freezing air sifts through a handful of small, hard objects. They are dried peas, cold and smooth like river pebbles, rattling faintly against the coarse fabric. The air in the street is thick with the smell of coal fires banked for the night, and the sharp metallic tang of the winter fog creeping up through the East End. The figure on the pavement withdraws a single pea, pinches it between a cold thumb and forefinger, and loads it into a slender rubber tube. She raises the tube to her cracked lips, tilting her head back to find the exact pane of glass on the second floor. She draws in a breath of air so cold it aches in the chest. Breath, aim, rattle. The peas strike the glass with a sharp staccato burst. It is a sound designed to pierce the heavy veil of sleep without shattering the fragile, cheap glass of the terrace window. We know her face. In the vast, largely unrecorded history of the working poor, the figure standing on the pavement in the early decades of the 20th century has left a rare and distinct footprint. Her name is Mary Smith. She worked the streets of Bethnal Green in East London, and she is the closest thing this hidden trade has to a named, documented anchor. She was captured in surviving photographs of the era, standing on the uneven paving stones, wrapped in a heavy coat and a patterned apron, blowing dried peas at the upper windows of her clients. Here, peering into the archive, we must be honest with the record. Mary Smith is a real, attested figure, but in our long walk through the industrial night, she stands as a representative anchor for the thousands of men and women who left only fragmented traces in the press and the parish ledgers. Not every detail of the freezing routes we will walk belongs exclusively to her single biography. But the shape of the life, the methods, the miles, the punishing exposure to the elements is deeply documented. Her face, looking up into the dark, stands for all of them. The tools of the trade were simple, adapted entirely from the immediate environment and the specific architecture of the street. Mary Smith's pea shooter was a localized solution, perfect for the three-story brick facades of East London, where the windows were sometimes too high or awkwardly recessed for a straight pole to reach. The pea shooter required a practiced lung capacity and a marksman's precision. A weak breath would fail to reach the glass. A careless shot might hit the brickwork and make no sound at all. She would fire a rapid volley, wait to see the flicker of a struck match or the pale shape of a face at the glass, and then move on. Up in the northern mill towns of Lancashire and Yorkshire, the architecture demanded a different instrument. There, the two-up, two-down terraced houses sat closer to the pavement, allowing for the most iconic tool of the trade, the long pole. These were often made of bamboo, favored for being incredibly lightweight, but rigid enough not to bow heavily in the middle. The poles were sometimes old fishing rods, stripped and repurposed. At the very tip, the knocker-up would fashion a modification to ensure the right kind of sound. Some tied a bundle of heavy wire to the end, designed to create a sharp scratching noise against the glass that was said to be far more irritating and therefore more effective at waking a sleeper than a simple knock. Others attached a heavy wooden knob or even bound the end in rags to produce a dull, heavy thud that would vibrate the entire window frame without breaking the pane. Tap, scrape, wait. The physical technique was a quiet art form. A heavy-handed strike could smash the window, bringing the fury of the homeowner and the cost of the glass down upon the waker. But a strike that was too light would fail to rouse the worker, costing them their shift and ensuring the knocker-up would lose a client by noon. The waker had to know the exact elasticity of the glass, the weight of the bamboo, and the depth of the client's sleep. They stood on the wet stone, balancing the long pole vertically, raising it through the freezing air, and delivering a controlled, rhythmic tap against the upper pane. They did not shout. They did not call out names. The work was done in a state of near total silence, a private transaction between the end of a bamboo pole and a frosted pane of glass. The physicality of the route was punishing. This was not a quick stroll down a single lane. A successful knocker-up carried a territory that might encompass several dozen, sometimes over 100 different windows. To cover the route before the factory whistles blew, they had to move with relentless ground-eating speed.
They walked miles through the pitch black, navigating uneven cobblestones, deep puddles of icy water, and the refuse of the gutters. Their boots were perpetually damp, the leather hardening in the frost. Every few yards, the rhythm was the same. Stop, plant the feet, tilt the head back, crane the neck, raise the heavy pole or the tube, strike and wait. The physical toll accumulated in the shoulders and the cervical spine. It was a trade of constant looking up while standing in the freezing dark. The muscles of the neck would seize in the damp air. The hands, gripping cold bamboo or a wet rubber tube for hours on end, would cramp and stiffen with early arthritis. There was no shelter to be taken. If a sudden, freezing rain swept off the North Sea and down the alleys, the knocker-up simply had to walk through it. The route could not be delayed by weather. The factory gate did not care if it was raining.
Cold, stone, dark. The economics of the route dictated this punishing speed. They were paid by the window, not by the hour. Every address was a carefully negotiated contract. To make a living, or even to supplement a meager household income, the knocker-up needed volume. This meant there was no time to linger, no time to chat if a window was opened. It was an economy of constant motion. The route was a geography of trust, walked in the dead of night, measured in copper pennies, and enforced by the looming threat of the factory whistle. We know the reality of these routes not just from the oral histories of the mill towns, but from the strict documentation of the period press. The knocker-up was not an underground figure or a casual neighborhood favor. This was a formalized, recognized service within the working-class economy. If one opens the local newspapers of Bradford, Manchester, or Leeds in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, their ghosts remain in the ink. There are small advertisements posted by men and women offering their services to specific streets or newly built terraces. There are notices of routes being sold as an older knocker-up retired and passed their profitable territory to a younger successor for a lump sum. There is also a record in the police reports and magistrates' courts. The press occasionally documented the bitter disputes that arose when a knocker-up's work disturbed those who did not need to be awake. A solicitor or a shopkeeper living adjacent to a factory worker might complain to the local constable about the incessant scratching of wire on glass at 4 in the morning. But the magistrates, understanding the absolute economic necessity of the trade, rarely intervened heavily. The city needed the workers awake, and the workers needed the tap on the glass. For Mary Smith and the thousands of nameless figures wielding bamboo poles in the northern dark, the record they left is one of relentless reliability. They were the human infrastructure that underpinned the industrial boom. But when the newspaper ink dried and the photograph was taken, the reality of the moment returned to the street. The transaction was deeply solitary. Mary would fire her dried peas. She would wait on the pavement, a small dark shape against the brickwork. She would watch the glass until a hand reached up and pulled back a sliver of curtain, or until the faint, warm glow of a match illuminated the frost on the inside of the pane. A nod, a confirmation. The contract for the day was fulfilled. She would lower the tube, turn her collar against the wind, and begin the walk to the next door, leaving the newly awakened worker to face the morning while she disappeared back into the dark.
To walk the pre-dawn streets with the waker is to realize that the work was only partially physical. The aching shoulders, the stiff neck, and the frozen hands grasping the bamboo were merely the mechanism of delivery. The true labor of the knocker-up took place entirely in the dark, silent architecture of the mind. The route was not simply a physical path drawn across the wet cobblestones. It was a complex, living ledger held without a single scrap of paper or a drop of ink. There were no printed schedules clutched in freezing fingers. Paper would not survive the driving sleet of a Lancashire winter. It would dissolve into a wet pulp within the first hour of the shift. Nor could any written list be read in the absolute gasless black of a 3 a.m. alleyway. Carrying a lantern was entirely out of the question. A lantern required a free hand, and both hands were desperately needed to manage the weight and balance of the long pole or to steady the pea shooter. Furthermore, oil or tallow candle cost precious money, cutting directly into the meager copper pennies earned by the night's work. So the knocker-up walked in the absolute dark, relying on a memory that had to be as rigid, flawless, and unyielding as the iron gates of the mills they served. Imagine the sheer cognitive weight of this invisible register. A successful route in a dense factory town might encompass 80 to over 100 individual windows spread out across a dozen winding, identical terraced streets. The knocker-up had to know not just the name of the street and the house number, but the specific pane of glass and the precise, unforgiving minute it needed to be struck. The industrial city was not uniform in its demands. It was a fractured clock of competing industries. Number 14 on the row might house a railway shunter who needed waking at exactly 3:30 for the freight yards. Number 16 might hold a family of weavers whose mill gate closed at 5:15. At number 20, the situation could be fiercely complicated. A crowded, damp lodging house where a coal miner in the front ground floor room required a heavy rap on the wooden frame at 4, while a young piecer sleeping in the upper back bedroom needed a soft, localized tap on the top left pane of glass at 5. To strike the wrong window was to wake an exhausted, desperate man an hour before his shift, an offense that could cost the waker a client on the spot. To forget a window entirely was far worse. It meant a docked wage, an empty grate, a starving week for the worker. The route was, at its core, a contract of absolute trust enforced by the brutality of the local economy. The knocker-up held the financial survival of 100 families inside their head. Tap. Pause. Move. They navigated the identical soot-stained brick facades not by sight, for there was often nothing to see, but by texture, sound, and rhythm. They knew the layout of the streets by the uneven dip of a specific paving stone beneath their boot. They oriented themselves by the smell of the damp ash pit behind the baker's yard or the iron scrape of a loose cellar grate that shifted slightly when stepped upon. They counted unseen paces in the pitch black, measuring the distance between a lamp post that had not been lit and a corner that could not be seen. They held a mental map that was constantly shifting, updating, and revising itself with the restless rhythm of the town. A route was not simply stumbled upon, it was fiercely acquired and fiercely held. A territory was a livelihood, the difference between eating and going to the workhouse. You did not casually walk into another waker's street and begin tapping on glass. The boundaries were invisible but rigidly respected, often drawn along the lines of specific mills, parishes, or railway tracks. Clients were won through quiet, desperate word of mouth. A transaction might be agreed upon in the brief, exhausted hours of a Sunday afternoon, or arranged by a mill foreman seeking to ensure his entire spinning room arrived on time. Sometimes a piece of chalk scrawled on a slate by the back door indicated a new client or a sudden change in shift. The knocker-upper would have to run their fingers over the slate in the dark, feeling the chalk dust, or strike a single match, shielding it from the wind, to read the crude writing.
Often, these routes were treated as genuine assets, pieces of invisible real estate passed down through the shadows. An aging knocker-upper whose joints could no longer endure the punishing winter damp might sell their territory to a younger successor for a lump sum of a few shillings. They would walk the route together for a week, passing on the mental ledger. The older knocker-upper would point out the fragile glass at number 12 that required a soft touch, the heavy sleeper at number 40 who needed 3 sharp raps, the vicious dog tied up in the alleyway behind the butcher. The transfer of the route was the transfer of a community's heartbeat, handed over in the freezing fog. That heartbeat was not static. The waker breathed with the seasons and the highly volatile tides of the industrial economy. The waker's mental register had to adapt instantly to the whims of the factory owners. If a textile mill secured a massive government contract for military uniforms, the overseer might impose mandatory overtime, shifting the entire street's waking hour back by 45 minutes. If a dockyard strike brought the freight trains to a halt, the shunting yards would fall silent, and 20 men on the route would suddenly not need to be wakened at all. The knocker-upper absorbed the shock waves of the Victorian economy directly into their sleeping schedule, rearranging their 100-window puzzle overnight.
The seasons, too, violently altered the shape of the ledger. Summer was the lean time. When the sun began to lighten the sky by 4 in the morning, many workers trusted the pale dawn to wake them, quietly dropping their subscription to the knocker-up to save a few pennies. The route would thin out, the territory shrinking to only the heaviest sleepers, the windowless basement rooms, and the earliest shifts. The waker had to stretch their winter savings, surviving on a fraction of their usual income. But when November arrived and the long, bitter dark settled over the north of England, the route swelled again. The fear of the dark was the fear of the locked gate. The knocker-up became indispensable, the sole navigator in a sea of freezing black fog. In this way, the figure holding the bamboo pole inherited an ancient, sacred function, quietly transforming it for the soot-stained industrial age. For centuries, the marking of time for the community had belonged exclusively to the church. The parish bell was the voice of the village. It rang the passing bell for the dead. It tolled for the Mass. It marked the curfew and the start of the harvest. It gathered the community, warning them of fire, calling them to prayer, anchoring their lives in a shared, communal rhythm. The factory whistle shattered that old rhythm, replacing the spiritual with the mechanical. But the whistle only blew at the end of the journey. It did not guide the worker out of the dark. The knocker-up became the secular, silent bell ringer of the new era. Instead of a resonant bronze bell echoing across an open green valley, it was the sharp, highly localized strike of wire on cheap glass. Instead of a priest or a church warden, it was a woman in a heavy apron or an old man with a cane. But the function remained exactly the same, marking the boundary between the private rest of the night and the public demand of the day. They were the keepers of the industrial time. As they moved down the terrace, their progress was a rolling, invisible wave of awakening. Behind them, the street slowly hissed to life. Match strikes flared softly behind the thin lace curtains. The smell of cheap coal smoke began to rise from the chimney pots as fires were hastily lit to boil water for a meager breakfast. The clatter of wooden clogs sounded faintly on the interior floorboards, followed by the heavy opening of front doors. But the knocker-up did not stop to witness the life they had just started. The ledger in their mind was still open, the clock was still ticking, and the territory stretched on into the biting wind.
They turned their back to the newly lit windows, adjusted their freezing grip on the cold pole, and walked further into the dark, carrying the survival of the next street entirely in their head.
It begins with a sudden, violent jolt in the absolute dark. There is no sound to provoke it. No tap on the glass, no whistle blowing in the distance, no shift in the heavy, frozen air of the bedroom. It is simply the body, startling itself awake in a cold sweat. The eyes open to a room so pitch black that being awake looks exactly the same as being asleep. The chest heaves once, drawing in the damp, freezing air that tastes of stale soot and cold ash. The heart races, hammering against the ribs with the immediate, terrifying panic of a single question. What time is it? Jolt. Breath. Dark. This is the great unanswered curiosity that hangs over the pre-dawn street. If the entire machinery of the industrial city, the spinning mules, the railway yards, the blast furnaces, and the deep coal seams, relied entirely on the knocker-up to pull it from the heavy depths of sleep, how did the human clock start its own ticking? When the margin of error was measured in a matter of minutes and the consequence of failure was a neighborhood starved of its wages, who held the responsibility of waking the waker? The answer lies in a fragile, desperate web of workarounds, all born from the profound irony of the trade. The knocker-up existed to provide the certainty of time to the working masses, but it was a certainty they were entirely denied in their own lives. They could not hire their own services. They could not afford the brass mechanical clocks that sat in the parlors of the wealthy. They were forced to manufacture their own awakening in the dead center of the night. For many of the older, deeply established wakers, the answer was the most punishing method of all. They relied entirely on their own internal clock. But this was not the gentle, natural waking of a body that has finished its rest. This was a biological rhythm forged in the fires of pure, sustained anxiety. To understand this, one must understand the nature of sleep when survival depends on waking at 2 or 3 in the morning. It is never a deep, restorative unconsciousness. It is a shallow, fractured, fiercely guarded state of resting. The brain remains partially alert, keeping a constant paranoid tally of the passing hours in the dark. The waker would lie on the thin mattress, listening to the subtle shifts in the night, the dying hiss of the neighbor's fire through the thin brick wall, the specific hollow sound of a stray dog's paws on the frozen cobblestones, the distant muffled chime of a church clock carrying on a favorable wind. They trained their bodies to snap awake at the precise moment the temperature of the room reached its absolute lowest point, that stagnant, deathly still hour before the earth even considered turning toward the sun. It was an unnatural conditioning, paid for with chronic, compounding exhaustion. The unspoken cost of the occupation was a permanent, grinding sleep deprivation that settled into the joints and hollowed out the eyes. They lived in a perpetual state of twilight fatigue, their bodies operating as overwound springs, ready to snap at the slightest shift in the dark.
Where the internal clock was deemed too fragile a guarantee, the waker turned to the few living things that kept older hours than the factory gate. In the sprawling, densely packed slums of the northern mill towns, the rural past had not been entirely paved over. Behind the soot-stained brick terraces, in the tiny walled backyards filled with coal bunkers and damp ash pits, families often kept a few shivering chickens. The cockerel, ignorant of the Industrial Revolution, remained a reliable, if fiercely unpredictable, alarm. A knocker-up might arrange their sleeping quarters as close to the back wall as possible, relying on the bird's first ragged crow in the dead of night. But an animal is not a machine.
A cockerel might crow at 2 in the morning because a rat scurried across the yard, or it might stay silent until 3 because the freezing fog was too thick. It was a desperate, precarious reliance on the natural world to serve a fiercely unnatural economy. Because biology and livestock were inherently fallible, the true safety net of the knocker-up lay in a quiet, undocumented symbiosis of the night workers. The pre-dawn street, while entirely empty of the decent sleeping public, had its own hidden ecosystem, and the most reliable element of that ecosystem was the night police. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the local constabulary walked highly regulated, meticulously timed beats through the industrial wards. Clad in heavy wool uniforms and thick-soled boots, carrying wooden truncheons and bullseye lanterns, these men were the only other figures mandated to be awake and moving through the freezing black labyrinth of the town. Over time, a quiet, informal arrangement developed between the law and the wakers. It was not a service written into any police manual, nor was it officially sanctioned by the magistrates, but it is heavily documented in the oral histories and local press accounts of Lancashire and Yorkshire. A knocker-up would speak to the local constable who walked their specific street at 2 in the morning. A localized, silent contract was formed. As the policeman passed the waker's terrace house on his patrol, he would step up to the lower window. He would not shout or cause a disturbance that might wake the day workers. Instead, he would take his heavy wooden truncheon and deliver a sharp, solid rap against the wooden frame of the door or the edge of the glass. Boot. Wood. Nod. Inside, the knocker-up, sleeping lightly in the front room precisely for this moment, would strike a match. The sudden, brief flare of yellow light behind the thin curtain was the signal. The constable, satisfied that the human clock had been wound, would adjust his lantern and continue his heavy, measured pacing down the cobbles. No money changed hands. It was a mutual recognition of the edge workers, a quiet solidarity among those who occupied the cold, lonely hours while the rest of the empire slept. In towns where the police beats did not align with the wakers' schedule, the knocker-ups formed their own fragile daisy chains of awakening. They built small, highly localized networks of mutual reliance. An older waker, perhaps one who suffered from insomnia and naturally woke at 1 in the morning, would take on the responsibility of starting the chain. They would rise, wrap themselves in their heavy coat, and walk 2 streets over to tap on the window of a second knocker-up. That second waker, now roused, would dress and move to wake a third. It was a brilliant, precarious system, a domino effect of tapping bamboo that slowly spread across the sleeping city. But it carried an immense, terrifying pressure for the first node in the network. If the first waker's internal clock failed, if they succumbed to the heavy, crushing weight of a winter fever and slept through the hour, the chain would break. 3 different routes would go unwalked. 300 men would miss the factory gate. The economic devastation would ripple through the ward by sunrise. The burden of that responsibility ensured that the first waker almost never slept at all, lying awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to be time. When we look back at the trade, stripping away the quaintness of the bamboo pole and the dried peas, we are left with the brutal physical reality of this arrangement. The knocker-up was an essential utility, as necessary to the mill owner as coal or water. They provided the foundational layer of discipline that allowed the Industrial Revolution to function. They guaranteed the morning. Yet, the central tragedy of their existence was embedded in the very nature of their work. They were the architects of punctuality for an entire city, but they lived entirely without a safety net of their own. They dragged thousands of exhausted bodies out of the dark, yet no one was paid to drag them out of the dark. They absorbed the anxiety of the morning so that the weavers and the shunters and the piecers could sleep for 20 more minutes. The physical deterioration was inevitable. The joints stiffened, the lungs grew heavy with the damp, the mind frayed at the edges from years of fragmented, paranoid sleep. They were a human sacrifice to the mechanical clock, burning their own vitality to keep the iron gates fed. They stood on the freezing pavement, looking up at the warm glow of a freshly lit match behind the glass, knowing that the person inside was cursing the early hour, cursing the cold, and cursing the day ahead. But the worker inside had a schedule. They had a destination. They had been delivered safely from the night. The figure standing on the cobbles below had no such comfort. She sold the morning to the street and never once bought it for herself.
The transaction was almost entirely invisible, leaving no paper trail and requiring no signature. It was finalized at the end of the week, often on a Saturday afternoon, when the brutal machinery of the town finally ground to a temporary halt. The payment was small, heavy, and physical. A handful of copper coins, dark with the residue of uncounted passing hands, smelling faintly of old grease, damp earth, and cold brass. They were passed across a narrow threshold, dropped into a rough, cold palm, or left resting on a soot-stained windowsill to be collected in the dark. Copper, frost, survival. To understand the long walk of the knocker-up is to understand the microscopic, desperate financial ecosystem that sustained it. This was not a trade of luxury or convenience. It was a trade built entirely on fear. The human waker was, at their core, a walking insurance policy against total economic ruin. Consider the terrifying arithmetic of the industrial working class. In the mid-19th century, a spinner or a weaver in the northern mills might earn, depending on their skill and the generosity of the overlooker, between 10 and 20 shillings for a grueling 60-hour week. From this meager sum, the rent for the damp terrace house was immediately extracted. Then came the cost of coal, an absolute necessity for survival in the bitter northern winters. Then came the bread, the oats, and perhaps a small cut of cheap meat for the Sunday pot. Every single halfpenny was accounted for before the worker even held the wage packet in his hands. Now, introduce the factory fine. As we have seen, the mill gates were unforgiving. A worker arriving even a few minutes late might be fined 3 pence, 4 pence, or locked out for a quarter of the day, losing a substantial fraction of their weekly survival margin in a single careless morning. If a man overslept by an hour, the overlooker might simply dismiss him entirely, replacing him instantly with one of the dozens of desperate, hungry men waiting outside the factory walls. To lose a job was to lose the house. To lose the house was to face the workhouse. Against this towering, catastrophic risk stood the knocker-up. The price of their service was incredibly small. In the surviving accounts and local press advertisements of the northern mill towns, the documented rates were startlingly uniform. A standard wake, a simple tap on a second-story window until a light appeared, typically cost between a penny halfpenny and 2 pence per week. It was a brilliant, necessary bargain. For less than the price of a cheap loaf of bread, a worker could guarantee their wage packet against the devastating threat of the locked gate. They were not paying for a luxury. They were paying a few coppers to keep the roof over their heads. But for the knocker-up, this mathematics created a grueling physical reality.
Earning 2 pence a week from a single client was not enough to survive. To make a living wage, or even to meaningfully supplement a household income, the waker required immense volume. To earn just 10 shillings a week, a modest surviving wage for a single person, they needed to maintain a route of at least 60 regular paying clients.
60 windows, 60 accurate strikes, 60 successful wakenings delivered in the pitch black 6 days a week, regardless of the freezing rain, the biting sleet, or the suffocating yellow fog rolling off the canals. The economy of the knock was an economy of sheer, punishing repetition. As the week wore on, the weight of those coppers slowly accumulated in the deep pockets of the waker's heavy wool coat, a physical drag against the legs as they walked the freezing miles. Not every window cost the same. The unwritten ledger of the street contained premium rates for complicated labor. A standard 2-story terrace window was a straightforward 2 pence, but if a client lived in the high attic of a taller tenement, requiring a heavier, longer pole and far more physical exertion to reach, the price might rise to 3 pence or 4 pence a week. There were also complex households that demanded a staggered, multi-tiered waking process. Loom, gate, ledger. Consider the lodging houses that proliferated in the industrial slums. These were damp, overcrowded terraced homes where transient laborers, railway navvies, and unmarried mill hands rented beds by the night or the week. The landlord of a lodging house became the primary client. He would hire the knocker-up on a bulk contract. For a slightly higher weekly fee, the waker would visit the house 3 separate times in a single morning. A heavy rap on the ground floor shutters at 3:30 for the railway shunters. A tap on the 2nd-story glass at 4:15 for the miners. A final sharp volley of dried peas against the attic pane at 5 for the cotton piecers. The waker managed the intricate schedule of the house from the outside, keeping the landlord's precarious economy intact. Foremen and mill overlookers also engaged directly in this hidden economy. While they were the ruthless enforcers of the factory clock during the day, they were completely dependent on their workers arriving in the dark. A spinning room could not function if half the hands were missing. The machines required absolute synchrony. To protect their own production quotas and their standing with the mill owners, a foreman might discreetly hire a knocker-up to rouse his entire shift. He would hand the waker a list of names and addresses, paying a flat weekly fee out of his own pocket to ensure that when he drew back the heavy iron bolt of the gate, his men were standing on the cold cobbles, ready to work. Yet, for all its structural necessity, the trade of the knocker-up was deeply fragile, held hostage by the relentless turning of the earth. The waker's economy was strictly seasonal, and the summer months were a time of deep, quiet desperation. Sun, light, loss. When May and June arrived in the northern latitudes, the sky began to bleed a pale, watery gray as early as 3 in the morning. By 4, there was enough natural light to illuminate a sparsely furnished bedroom. For the working families living on the ragged edge of starvation, this early dawn presented an opportunity for brutal economy.
Trusting the natural light to wake them, or perhaps tying a string to a toe and leaving the end dangling out the window for an early rising neighbor to pull, many workers would temporarily suspend their contract with the knocker-up. To save 2 pence a week in the summer was to afford an extra handful of oats, a slightly better cut of bacon, or a new pair of wooden soles for a child's clogs. For the waker, the summer sun was an economic disaster. The dense, sprawling route of 80 windows would suddenly thin to a scattered, skeletal 20.
Their income would drop by 2/3 overnight, even as the rent for their own dwelling remained exactly the same. They were forced into severe austerity, stretching their winter savings, burning less coal, and often taking on grueling daytime labor, scrubbing floors, washing laundry, or hauling coal, just to survive the bright months. They lived in anticipation of November, when the long, impenetrable dark returned and the freezing rain began to lash against the brickwork. The fear of the invisible morning returned with it. The workers retreated from their reliance on the dawn, turning once again to the human clock. The knocks resumed. The coppers began to fill the heavy apron pockets once more. The transaction, in the end, was never really about the physical act of tapping on the glass. The 2 pence a week did not buy the bamboo pole, nor did it buy the handful of dried peas. It bought the only thing that mattered in the industrial slum. It bought the morning. It bought certainty in a world that offered none. The worker lay in the dark, muscles aching, lungs heavy with cotton dust, knowing that they did not have to bear the crushing weight of watching the time. They had outsourced their anxiety to the solitary figure walking the wet, freezing cobblestones outside. The waker bore the cold. The waker bore the fear. The waker carried the clock, step by step, house by house, earning a handful of old copper for holding back the ruin of the town.
There is a profound physical difference between the dark of midnight and the dark of 3 in the morning. Midnight still carries the bruised, lingering echoes of the day. There might be a warm hearth quietly dying in a front room, the distant, muffled shout of a tavern closing its doors, or the settling creak of floorboards as a family finally finds its rest. But by 3 in the morning, the industrial city has achieved an absolute, deathly suspension. The air grows entirely stagnant. The dampness that hung in the evening fog settles and freezes onto the brickwork, coating the world in a slick, black rime. The temperature reaches its absolute lowest point, stealing the breath from the lungs and sinking deep into the marrow. Cold, stone, still. To step out into a northern terraced street at this hour is to step into a complete void. It is a geography of total exile. For the knocker-up, stepping off their own threshold and pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind them meant entering a world that was entirely inverted. The natural posture of the human race at 3 in the morning was horizontal. Behind the thousands of identical, rattling window panes, the population of the city was laid flat, surrendered to the heavy, gravitational pull of exhaustion. The workers were static, bundled under thin wool blankets and heavy coats thrown over the beds for extra warmth, breathing the stale, trapped air of the cramped rooms. The waker, by absolute contrast, was vertical. They were forced into motion, propelled by the relentless ticking of the unseen clock. This physical inversion, being the only body standing upright and moving in a world of prone, unconscious figures, created a deep psychological isolation. The knocker-up was a ghost haunting a graveyard of the living. They walked through the center of a densely packed community of thousands, yet they were entirely, profoundly alone. The pre-dawn street was emptied of everything that made it a neighborhood. The hawkers, the playing children, the gossiping neighbors, the rattling delivery carts, all the noise and friction of daytime existence was erased. What remained was merely the stark, brutal architecture of the slum,
The sheer walls of soot-stained brick, the uneven, freezing York stone of the pavement, and the narrow, black channels of the alleys leading toward the looming shadow of the mill. The waker did not have the street entirely to themselves, but the few figures they did encounter only deepened the sense of exile. The night had its own sparse, silent cast of edge workers. As the knocker-up navigated the wet cobblestones, they might pass a local constable standing perfectly still beneath a sputtering gas lamp, the heavy wool of his uniform absorbing the freezing mist. A brief, almost imperceptible nod of the head was the only exchange. There was no conversation to be had. Down at the end of a narrow back alley, the slow, heavy grind of wooden cartwheels on stone might signal the arrival of the night soil men, quietly and thanklessly emptying the ash pits and privies while the decent world slept. In the far distance, down by the dark water of the canal, the rhythmic metallic clanking of a lone railway shunter coupling freight cars echoed through the fog. And occasionally, huddled in a doorway or stumbling blindly against a brick wall, there would be the tragic, frozen shape of a late-stage drunk, locked out of their lodgings and entirely surrendered to the cold.
These encounters were not moments of connection. They were merely shadows passing shadows in the deep water of the night. The waker kept walking. The route demanded pace. The true boundary of their isolation was not the end of the street, but the thin pane of window glass. The window was the absolute interface of their trade, the membrane between the freezing, public dark and the private, vulnerable warmth of the home. As the knocker-up stood on the paving stones, tilting their head back to guide the long bamboo pole to the upper sash, they were constantly looking at a world they were forbidden to enter. Glass. Tap. Wait. The lace curtain, cheap and yellowed with coal smoke, hung behind the glass like a barrier. The waker would strike the pane. They would stand in the biting wind, their boots soaking through with icy water, their hands cramping around the cold bamboo. They would wait in the absolute dark until they saw the faint, desperate spark of a match inside the room. Through the frosted glass, they would watch the soft orange glow bloom in the dark. They could see the blurred shape of a hand sheltering the flame, the silhouette of a heavy coat being pulled over shivering shoulders. In that brief moment, the knocker-up brought life back to the room. They summoned the light, but the light was not for them. The transaction was entirely devoid of hospitality. The waker was never invited inside to sit by the freshly lit fire. They were never offered a cup of hot water or a moment to thaw their freezing joints. They were the architects of the morning, but they were strictly denied its comforts. The relationship between the worker and the waker was of absolute, desperate dependency, but it was completely stripped of friendship. In truth, the worker behind the glass likely harbored a quiet, instinctual resentment toward the knocker-up. No exhausted, broken body wishes to be violently dragged from sleep at 4 a.m. The sound of the bamboo pole scratching against the glass was the sound of a prison door locking, a harsh reminder that the brief respite of the night was over and the brutal reality of the factory floor had returned. The knocker-up was the messenger of a terrible necessity, and as such, they were endured, paid, and largely ignored. They were an essential mechanism of the industrial city, yet they were treated with the same emotional indifference as the factory whistle or the heavy iron hinges of the gate. She wakes the world to work, and the world wakes without her name.
As the hours ground on and the route stretched into its final grueling miles,
The physical toll of this exile settled heavily on the waker's shoulders. The cold was no longer just an environmental condition. It felt like a physical weight pressing down on the back of the neck. The dampness seeped through the layers of heavy wool, chilling the skin to the point of numbness. But there was no shelter to be taken. To stop walking was to freeze, and to fail the route was to starve. And then, around 5:30 or 6 in the morning, the nature of the street would violently change. The route would end. The final window would be struck. The final match would flare behind the glass. The waker would lower the bamboo pole, the muscles in their back screaming in quiet protest, and lean it against a brick wall. All at once, the terraced houses would begin to purge their inhabitants. Front doors, heavy and damp, would open in rapid succession down the length of the row. Men and women, heads down against the bitter wind, clutching shawls tight across their chests, would step out onto the very cobblestones the waker had walked in absolute solitude just an hour before. The clatter of wooden clogs, hundreds of them striking the stone in a chaotic, deafening rhythm, would rise up and swallow the silence of the night. The street, which had been a desolate, empty wasteland, was suddenly a rushing, violent river of humanity. The workers flooded down the alleys, merging into larger streams on the main thoroughfares, all drawn by the magnetic, terrifying pull of the mill gate. Standing on the corner, holding their empty pea shooter or their heavy pole, the knocker-up was instantly swallowed by the crowd. In the dark, they had been the sole authority, the master of the silent street. Now, in the gray, watery light of the impending dawn, they were rendered entirely invisible. The people they had painstakingly woken, the very bodies they had saved from the fine board and the locked gate, brushed past them without a single glance of recognition. The waker was just another ragged shape in the freezing fog, moving against the tide, heading back to a cold, empty hearth, while the rest of the world marched toward the fire of the furnaces. They had sold the night, and they were left empty-handed in the day. From today's view, it's the tragic isolation of a figure locked outside the very community they kept alive, the profound, quiet loneliness of being the only one awake to carry the burden of the dark. From their view, it was a necessary, practical exile, a physical boundary enforced by the brutal economics of the Victorian night, where warmth cost money and time waited for no one. And that's what's so chilling.
The heavy wooden door closes, cutting off the vast, freezing expanse of the street. The iron latch drops into its housing with a dull, metallic click. The transition from the public dark of the terrace row to the private dark of the home is not marked by a sudden rush of warmth or comfort. It is merely a shift from the biting, kinetic wind of the alleys to a stagnant, settled chill. The knocker-up has crossed their own threshold, returning to the very space they left hours ago. The route is finished. The mental ledger is closed for the day, but the unrecorded hours are only just beginning. Latch, wood, silence. Inside the narrow front room of the terraced house, the air is thick with the distinct metallic scent of cold ash. The grate is completely empty, the final embers of yesterday's meager coal allowance having surrendered to the damp long before the waker even began their round. In the absolute quiet of the early morning, before the hawkers begin to cry and the carts begin to rattle on the main thoroughfare, the house breathes with the sound of the sleeping. Upstairs, or perhaps huddled in the corner of the very room the waker now stands, the rest of the family remains unconscious. A husband, his lungs compromised by years in the carding room of the mill, draws a ragged, whistling breath in the dark. Children, bundled together under a single heavy wool blanket for shared body heat, shift on the thin mattress. The profound irony of the knocker-up's return is that they must now navigate their own home with the absolute stealth of an intruder. Having spent the last 3 hours violently dragging an entire neighborhood from its sleep, they must now move with excruciating care to preserve the rest of their own blood. They are not paid to wake their children. The physical recovery begins in the shadows. The waker sits heavily on a hard wooden chair in the kitchen, feeling for the laces of their boots in the pitch black. The leather is soaked through, hardened by the frost, and stiff with the freezing mud of 100 alleyways. Peeling the wet boots away from the feet is a slow, agonizing process. The damp wool of the socks clings to the skin. The soles of the feet, having pounded miles of uneven York stone, throb with a deep, bruised ache that radiates upward into the calves. The coat is removed next. In the deep midwinter, a heavy wool coat absorbs the freezing fog like a sponge. It does not dry while being worn. It simply becomes a cold, wet weight dragging against the shoulders. The waker hangs it on a wooden peg near the dead fire, knowing full well that when they put it on again the next night, it will still be damp, still hold the bitter chill of the previous route.
It is here, sitting in the dark, unlacing boots and unwrapping a wet shawl, that the true physical toll of the trade exacts its price on the human body in mid-age. Damp, ache, bone. The industrial era was incredibly unforgiving to the aging form, and the knocker-up carried a highly specific map of deterioration. The labor was defined by an unnatural posture held for hours in the worst possible elements. Carrying a long, heavy bamboo pole and constantly looking upward at second- and third-story windows created a permanent grinding damage to the cervical spine. The muscles of the neck and the upper shoulders seized in the damp air, hardening into permanent knots of tension. Over the years, many wakers developed a pronounced stoop, their bodies curving under the invisible weight of the dark. The hands bore the most visible scars of the route, gripping a cold wooden pole or a wet rubber tube for 3 hours in freezing temperatures, completely exposed to the wind, devastated the circulation. The knuckles swelled with early aggressive arthritis. The skin on the fingers cracked and split in the frost, leaving deep, painful fissures that blackened with soot and refused to heal until the brief respite of summer. If a waker could afford the luxury of boiling a small kettle of water over a newly lit fire, immersing their frozen hands in the warm basin would bring a burning, agonizing sting as the blood finally fought its way back into the capillaries. And then there were the lungs. The air of the pre-dawn industrial city was a toxic soup of freezing mist, unburned coal smoke, and the sulfurous exhalations of the factories banked for the night. To walk rapidly through this atmosphere, drawing deep, desperate breaths to fuel the miles, was to invite the damp directly into the chest. A chronic rattling cough was the occupational signature of the waker. It was a recurring chest cold that arrived in November, settled deep into the bronchial tubes, and simply did not leave until March. They coughed quietly into a rag in the dark kitchen, terrified of waking the house, feeling the sharp, tearing pain in their ribs with every suppressed spasm. The seasons dictated the exact flavor of this physical punishment, offering no genuine relief, only different variations of endurance. Winter was the crucible. The route was walked in genuine, absolute blackness, the kind of dark that felt heavy on the skin. When the sleet drove in horizontally off the North Sea, the waker had to lean their entire body weight against the wind just to maintain their footing on the slick cobbles. The cold was an aggressive, living thing that sought out every gap in their clothing. Summer, by contrast, offered a cruel, deceptive mercy. The air was warmer, and the pale, watery light of the early dawn meant they could see the uneven paving stones and avoid the deepest puddles of the gutters. But the physical exhaustion was identical, and the economic terror was far worse. The daylight meant fewer clients, which meant fewer copper pennies. The body was slightly warmer, but the stomach was vastly emptier. The waker walked the summer route under the pale sky, feeling the exact same ache in the joints, knowing they were earning half the wage for the same physical toll. Yet, perhaps the most brutal reality of the knocker-up's life was that the end of the route did not mean the end of the labor. When the waker sat in the dark kitchen at 6 in the morning, nursing their frozen hands and listening to the distant, shrieking hum of the factory whistle they had just populated, they were not preparing for a day of rest. The economics of the trade simply did not allow for it. Earning a few shillings a week from tapping on glass was rarely enough to sustain a family, particularly if the waker was a widow, or if their husband had been maimed by the unforgiving belts of the mill machinery. The knocker-up was almost always forced into a secondary, equally punishing economy to bridge the gap between survival and starvation. As the sun finally broke over the slate roofs, turning the thick fog an oily yellow, the unrecorded hours began. The waker would light the small fire, boil water, and feed the waking children a breakfast of thin oats. Then, with a body already deeply exhausted, lungs aching, and feet bruised, they would begin their second shift. For many women in the trade, this meant the grueling, back-breaking work of the charwoman. They would walk to the slightly more affluent terraces of the mill overlookers or the shopkeepers. They would trade the long bamboo pole for a heavy wooden bucket and a stiff, coarse scrubbing brush. Having spent the deep night looking up at the glass, they would spend the daylight hours on their knees looking down at the stone. They scoured the front steps with harsh lye soap, their hands plunged repeatedly into cold, gray water, the raw, cracked skin of their fingers burning mercilessly. Others took in vast loads of neighborhood laundry, standing over steaming copper boilers in cramped, windowless washhouses, breathing in the suffocating humidity that sat heavy on their already weakened lungs. Some wakers, incredibly, walked the pre-dawn route only to join the very people they had awakened, passing through the iron gates themselves to endure a 10-hour shift in the deafening roar of the weaving sheds.
These were the invisible, unrecorded hours. The historical ledger focuses entirely on the novelty of the long pole and the dried peas. The neighborhood only recognized the knocker-up when they were performing their appointed task in the dark. But when the sun was up, the waker simply dissolved into the gray, monolithic struggle of the working poor. No one was watching as they hauled wet linen across a cobbled yard. No one was recording the precise, agonizing moment when a knee joint locked while scrubbing a stone step. There was no whistle to mark the beginning or the end of this secondary survival. There was only the endless, rolling demand of the day. They existed in a perpetual state of motion, caught in an unending cycle of waking the world and then frantically serving it. The body was never allowed to fully stop, to fully heal, or to fully sleep. They burned their own vitality from both ends, spending their nights in the freezing damp and their days in the harsh friction of domestic labor, slowly wearing down the cartilage and the bone until there was nothing left to give. From today's view, it's the quiet tragedy that a profession defined by a single, highly public task hid a secondary, unseen life of crushing domestic labor. A realization that history often remembers the eccentricities of work while ignoring the desperate exhaustion that surrounded it. From their view, it was merely the blunt, unforgiving mathematics of survival, pushing a broken body through the unrecorded hours because rest was a luxury they could never afford. And that's what's so chilling. It begins with a physical gap. On a cold, soot-stained stone windowsill, sitting just outside the thin pane of frosted glass, lies a single copper coin. It has been there since midnight,
left deliberately on the masonry before a worker pulled the curtains and surrendered to the bed. By 4 in the morning, the face of the monarch stamped into the copper is completely obscured by a thin, glittering layer of white rime. The knocker-up steps out of the black fog, stands before the window, and reaches out a stiff, cracked hand. A thumb scrapes across the stone, collecting the frozen penny. It goes into the deep pocket of the heavy coat. A long bamboo pole is raised. A tap is delivered to the glass. A match flares inside. The knocker-up turns and walks away. Tap, gap, gone. There is no door opened. There is no hand-to-hand exchange. There is a nod that does not become a name, a transaction devoid of a greeting, a livelihood sustained by leaving money out in the freezing damp rather than facing the person who collects it. The coin on the sill is the absolute physical manifestation of the knocker-up's place in the industrial city. They were the architects of the morning, utterly essential to the survival of the neighborhood, yet they existed in a state of profound, orchestrated invisibility. To map the social geography of the Victorian slum is to realize that this invisibility was not a matter of physical distance. The knocker-up did not live in a secluded enclave on the outskirts of the town. They lived precisely in the center of the very community they served. They occupied the same damp 2-up, 2-down terraced houses. They shared the same thin, poorly mortared brick walls. They breathed the exact same air, thick with the metallic tang of unburned coal and the sour odor of the nearby canals. Yet proximity did not equal belonging. In a densely packed row of houses, number 14 might be a weaver, number 16 might be a railway shunter, and number 18 might be the knocker-up who woke them both. During the daylight hours, when the street was a chaotic rush of playing children, hawkers, and exhausted women scrubbing steps, the knocker-up was simply a quiet, tired neighbor, blending entirely into the ragged fabric of the working poor. But when the sun went down, the street fractured into 2 entirely separate dimensions. The workers retreated into the deep, motionless world of sleep, while the waker stepped out into the kinetic, freezing void. They lived side by side, but they were entirely segregated by the ruthless mechanics of time. The knocker-up was not alone in this temporal exile. The industrial engine required a vast, silent shadow workforce to maintain the infrastructure of the town, while the polite world and the day laborers slept. To look at the knocker-up is to look at the center of an entire cast of the necessary but invisible, the edge workers who inhabited the black hours.
Consider the lamplighter. Before the widespread adoption of electrical grids, the streets of the northern mill towns were illuminated by gas. The lamplighter moved through the early evening dusk and the deep pre-dawn dark, carrying a long pole fitted with a small shielded flame or a hook. He walked a vast, solitary route, reaching up to the iron stanchions to turn the gas valves, hissing the street lamps to life or extinguishing them into the fog. Like the knocker-up, the lamplighter was a solitary figure defined by a long pole and a relentless rhythm. He manipulated the boundaries of the dark, but his domain was entirely public. He lit the thoroughfares and the alleys, serving the abstract concept of the city itself. The knocker-up, by contrast, carried the dark directly to the intensely private threshold of the bedroom. The lamplighter touched cold iron. The knocker-up touched the fragile glass that separated a fragile family from the freezing wind. The lamplighter was ignored because he was part of the municipal furniture. The knocker-up was ignored because they were a trespasser on the edges of sleep. Consider the night watchman. At the end of the cobblestone street,
Behind the towering wrought-iron gates of the textile mill, an old man sat beside a glowing, smoking brazier. He was hired to guard the immense capital of the factory owners, the mountains of raw cotton, the stockpiles of expensive coal, the heavy brass and steel of the spinning mules against fire and desperate theft. The watchman was an edge worker defined by static isolation. He remained rooted to a single freezing courtyard, his world shrinking to the small orange radius of his coke fire. He waited for the morning to arrive. The knocker-up out in the labyrinth of the terraces was defined by kinetic isolation. They could not sit by a fire. They had to walk the miles, forcing the morning into existence, marching through the frozen streets to drag the workers from their beds so the watchman's gate could finally be opened. Both men were entirely alone in the dark, but one guarded the physical machinery of the town, while the other guarded its temporal pulse. And then, moving quietly down the narrow back alleys, there were the night soil men. In the sprawling, overcrowded slums of the 19th century, sanitation was a terrifying, fragile thing. The heavy wooden carts, drawn by slow, blinkered horses, arrived in the absolute dead of night. The men worked in silence, shoveling the ash pits and the overflowing privies, carting away the physical waste of tens of thousands of bodies. They performed a labor so deeply necessary to the prevention of cholera and typhoid that the city would collapse within a week without them. Yet the work was considered so unseemly it was strictly banished by law to the hours of darkness.
The night soil men carted away the physical refuse of the town, ensuring the streets were survivable. The knocker-up carted away the temporal refuse, the heavy, dangerous hours of oversleeping, ensuring the workers were employable. Both trades moved through the darkest, wettest, most miserable corners of the slums, providing an absolute utility while being completely scrubbed from the polite consciousness of the day. Iron, glass, stone. Yet the social isolation of the knocker-up contained a central, profound irony that separated them from other historical edge workers. When we look back at the grave-digger standing in the churchyard or the sin-eater sitting by the deathbed, their isolation is easy to understand. They were shunned because they were contaminated. They carried the heavy, terrifying taint of mortality. The public shrank from them out of a primal, superstitious fear of the dirt and the grave. The knocker-up carried no such taint. They did not deal in death. They dealt in survival. They did not touch the diseased or the dying. They touched a clean bamboo pole and a piece of window glass. They were not shunned because they were feared. They were shunned because they were entirely, perfectly invisible. The industrial worker did not view the knocker-up as a fellow human being shivering in the cold. They viewed them as an appliance. The knocker-up was the human equivalent of the factory whistle, a necessary, irritating mechanism that functioned precisely when it was supposed to and was instantly forgotten the moment its utility was spent. You do not invite an alarm clock in for a warm cup of tea. You do not ask a pocket watch about the ache in its joints. You simply rely on it to strike the hour, and you resent it for the noise it makes. The cruelty of this caste was not the cruelty of active persecution. It was the crushing, quiet cruelty of total indifference. The waker walked past the front door of their own neighbor, a man they might have known for 20 years, a man whose children played with their children in the summer. But at 4 in the morning, that relationship was entirely erased. The waker became nothing more than a shadow wielding a stick, and the neighbor became nothing more than a 2-pence contract. In the long dark before the whistle, she belongs to the root, not the house.
The waker accepted this absolute separation because the copper coin on the sill demanded it. There was no room for ego on the freezing cobblestones. The damp seeped into the boots, the wind whipped off the slate roofs, and the ledger in the mind pushed them endlessly forward.
Tap, gap, gone. As the deepest hours of the night roll on, the sensory reality of the street narrows to a tight, repetitive calm. The anger and the anxiety of the daytime world are stripped away, leaving only the hypnotic rhythm of the walk. A boot scraping on a wet stone, the soft wooden click of a bamboo pole striking a brick wall as the waker adjusts their grip, the faint, barely audible rattle of dried peas in a deep pocket. The body settles into a state of numbed, forward momentum. The cold becomes a constant, unchangeable fact, wrapping around the shoulders like a heavy blanket. The lungs find a shallow, steady rhythm, drawing in the freezing mist and letting it out in slow, white plumes that vanish instantly in the dark. Every house looks exactly the same. Every window is a black square holding a sleeping soul. The waker moves past them, a silent ghost in a city of stone. There is no need for thought, no need for worry, only the next address, the next pane of glass, the next strike. The rhythm is a sedative, a slow, methodical heartbeat that keeps the entire city alive while asking for absolutely nothing in return. Step, plant, raise, tap. The street breathes slowly around them, entirely unaware of the figure holding back the ruin of the dawn. From today's view, it is the strange, unsettling irony that an entire caste of workers built to pull others from the dark was themselves deliberately kept in the shadows, rendered invisible by the very people they saved. From their view, it was merely a practical arrangement the city desperately relied on but never formally acknowledged, a cold transaction where a coin left on the stone was the only recognition required. And that's what's so chilling.
The route unfolds in an endless, deeply monotonous sequence of identical wet stone and cold glass, house after house, alley after blind alley. The work is a blunt physical exercise in complete erasure. To walk the pre-dawn streets of a northern industrial town for years is to eventually accept a quiet, heavy kind of non-existence. The human form slowly becomes merely an extension of the long bamboo pole, a mechanical instrument of necessary noise moving steadily through a sleeping world. The silence of the deepest hour is absolute, broken only by the brutal crunch of frozen, soot-stained slush beneath worn leather boots and the rhythmic hollow rattle of dried peas shifting in a deep coat pocket. It is a world of total crushing indifference, where every identical terraced window is a blank stare and every wooden door is heavily bolted against the damp. The waker moves through this void like a shadow cast by a fire that went out hours ago. The freezing fog clings to the heavy wool of their coat, adding a literal weight to the already punishing physical labor of the miles. Yet in the vast, gray, unforgiving expanse of the industrial winter, the absolute uniformity of the dark was occasionally punctured. These interruptions were not grand revolutions, nor were they moments of sweeping social redemption that changed the brutal economics of the mill town. The caste of the edge workers did not magically dissolve because of a single kind word, and the grinding poverty of the terraces remained exactly as sharp and biting as the January frost. But every so often, the heavy, suffocating veil of invisibility flickered. A crack appeared in the ice. A human being remembered for the duration of a single freezing breath that the shadow standing out on the wet pavement was another living soul.
There were 3 small mercies that occasionally broke the dead monotony of the route. Not nearly enough to warm the night, but enough to prove that the freezing cold was truly felt by both sides of the window glass. The first mercy was the sudden, startling sound of a proper noun. For months, the interaction at number 34 on the long terrace row had been entirely transactional, completely mute, and rigidly predictable. The bamboo pole struck the upper second-story glass with 2 sharp raps. A match flared in the dark bedroom, casting a brief pale yellow triangle of light across the frost-rimed brickwork outside. A hand adjusted the iron window latch. A sleepy, guttural grunt of physical acknowledgement drifted down into the freezing alley, and the waker immediately moved on without a single word being exchanged. It was a relationship built entirely on kinetic response. Strike, light, fade.
Then came a bitter morning in late January, when the wind was howling down off the high moors, carrying a fine, stinging sleet that plastered the waker's heavy coat directly to their ribs. The pall hit the glass, the wood slick and freezing in the waker's cramped hands. But instead of the usual immediate pull of the cheap lace curtain, the wooden window sash scraped loudly upward, pushed open far wider than the cruel weather required. A man's face leaned out into the biting wind, his hair untidy, his eyes heavy and swollen with unspent sleep. He was a weaver, his shoulders already stooped from the loom. He did not grunt. He did not signal with a dismissive wave of a hand. He looked down through the driving sleet, squinted into the dark, found the shivering shape standing on the Yorkstone, and actually spoke. "Morning to you, Mary," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion, but entirely clear in the quiet air. Name, pause, thanks. It was a physical shock that cut much deeper than the wind. To hear a given name spoken aloud in the dead, solitary hours of the night, stripped of any economic demand, completely detached from the factory whistle or the looming terror of the fine board, was a profound disorientation. It was the sudden, startling realization that the man behind the glass actually knew exactly who was holding the pole. It was a fragile, fleeting restoration of human identity in a world that demanded only a function. For one single second, standing in the freezing sleet, she was not just an alarm clock or a municipal appliance. She was a person. The weaver pulled his window shut against the storm, the latch clicked heavily into place, and the match flared. But the air felt subtly, strangely different for the next 3 streets. The second mercy arrived not from an exhausted adult, but from the very bottom of the architectural world. In the cramped multi-family tenements built much closer to the canal, the ground-floor windows sat incredibly low to the wet pavement, barely 2 feet above the level of the overflowing gutter. The air here always tasted thicker, heavy with the smell of stagnant water and the slow rot of the wooden coal barges. These rooms were notoriously overcrowded, holding entire families in a single, damp, unventilated space where sleep was a fragmented, desperate commodity. Adults living in such crushing proximity developed a fierce, protective instinct to ignore the outside world, pulling heavy rags across the panes and aggressively teaching their children to sleep straight through the noise of the alley and the rats. Yet children possessed a radical, uncurbed curiosity that the brutal realities of the industrial slum could not entirely beat out of them in their earliest years. Approaching a low window on a moonless Tuesday, stepping carefully to avoid a deep puddle of freezing mud, the waker noticed a slight difference in the glass. There was no fern-like frost pattern on this particular pane. It had been melted away by the warm, steady breath of someone standing far too close to the cold barrier.
A small face was pressed entirely flat against the inside of the window. A child, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, wide-eyed and completely sleepless in the darkness, staring out into the absolute, terrifying blackness of the street. Normally, an exhausted adult would have intervened instantly. A heavy hand would have yanked the child back from the freezing glass, scolding them harshly for catching a chill, pulling the rag curtain shut with an angry, dismissive snap. But the room behind the child was dead silent. The parents were sunk deep in the profound, leaden sleep of the utterly physically broken, entirely unaware of the watcher at the glass. The child stayed. There was no fear in the small, pale oval pressed against the window, only a quiet, unblinking fascination with the dark, heavy shape moving down the street in the dead of night. The waker paused, breaking the relentless, ticking rhythm of the route for the space of a single heartbeat. In the freezing air, she slowly raised a thickly gloved hand in a tiny, almost imperceptible gesture, a slow, deliberate movement of the fingers against the pitch black. On the other side of the glass, a small bare palm mirrored the motion, pressing perfectly flat against the outside frost. It was a look held for one breath too long. There was no financial utility in it, no exchange of coppers, no guarantee of a factory shift met. It was pure, unadulterated human recognition passing through a dirty, cheap pane of glass between two people who had absolutely no business being awake at that hour. The child finally blinked, the heavy lids surrendering to the crushing weight of exhaustion, and the small face drifted back into the deep shadows of the room. The waker lowered her hand, adjusted the freezing grip on her pole, and stepped back into the wet fog, carrying the silent ghost of that small palm in her pocket. The third mercy was the most tangible, the most physically desperate, and the most fiercely fleeting of all. Toward the far, desolate edge of the route, where the tightly packed terraced brick finally gave way to the open, freezing waste ground, stood a small, isolated stone cottage. The massive iron skeleton of the town gasworks loomed just behind it, venting pale, sulphurous steam into the black sky. The cottage was inhabited by an aging widow who took in heavy washing. She was not a mill hand, and she did not march to the iron gates at dawn, but she had engaged the knocker-up to ensure she was awake to stoke her massive copper boilers long before the first heavy loads of wet, freezing laundry were dragged to her door. On mornings when the frost was thick enough to snap dry twigs like glass underfoot, the transaction at this lonely cottage changed entirely. There was no cold copper coin left on the stone window-sill. Instead, resting precisely in the center of the granite sill, right beside the dark, circular patch where the bamboo pole usually landed, sat a heavy, coarse earthenware mug. Cup, warmth, quiet. It was filled to the brim with hot water steeped in burnt crusts of bread and a hard scrap of chicory root. It was a bitter, dark gray substitute for proper tea, tasting faintly of ash, but it carried an immense, radiating core of absolute heat. The widow did not open the door to invite the waker inside. She did not offer a wooden seat by her hearth or ask her to stop for a conversation that would ruin the rigid schedule of the route and doom the other workers on the ledger. She understood the cruel, unforgiving mathematics of the hour entirely too well to ask for a pause. She simply opened the heavy wooden door a mere 3 inches, placed the steaming mug on the freezing sill with a rapt hand, and closed the iron latch again without a single word passing between them in the dark. The knocker-up would step out of the fog, drop her heavy pole against the brickwork, and wrap her raw, cracked hands completely around the coarse earthenware.
The intense heat would bite fiercely into the numb, dead skin of her fingers, sending a sharp, painful, agonizing rush of thawing blood up into her wrists and forearms. She would drink the bitter, warm liquid in 3 rapid, desperate gulps, feeling the thick steam clear the damp from the back of her throat and settle into her freezing chest, before gently setting the empty mug back down on the stone. It was a profound warmth that did not ask her to stop being the knocker-up. It asked for no narrative, it demanded no weeping gratitude, and it forced no change in the rigid mechanics of the hour. It was simply one struggling, exhausted human being passing a small pocket of fire to another across the cold, dark threshold of the dawn. These 3 moments, a spoken name cutting through the sleet, a child's unblinking stare holding back the dark, a bitter cup of warm chicory water left deliberately on the stone, were the absolute, defining limit of the pre-dawn street's mercy. They were fragile, fiercely isolated interruptions in an ocean of stone, brick, and total indifference. They did not rewrite the brutal reality of the trade. When the mug was set down and the gasworks were left behind, the cold returned with a doubled aggressive vengeance, and the remaining windows were no less blank, no less heavy with the terrifying weight of the coming shift.
Indeed, by temporarily breaking the uniform, protective numbness of the exile, these incredibly rare mercies served only to highlight the vast, freezing emptiness that surrounded them. They made the rest of the unseen hours feel infinitely colder, precisely because they reminded the waker of what warmth and recognition actually felt like, right before pulling them violently back into the dark. In the long dark before the whistle, she belongs to the root, not the house. She turns away from the cottage window, picks up her heavy, wet bamboo pole, and steps back into the gray, freezing mist of the alley. The cold copper coin is deep in her pocket. The memory of a spoken name hangs briefly in the damp air before dissolving entirely into the heavy breath of the waking town. She wakes the world to work, and the world wakes without her name. The street stretches onward, an unbroken, endless labyrinth of sleeping houses waiting to be dragged into the unforgiving machinery of the day. The pole strikes the glass, the match flares, the routine resumes its absolute, unyielding grip. From today's view, it's the heartbreaking realization that human connection in the industrial city had to be stolen in microdoses, surviving only as brief, accidental fractures in a massive system built entirely for labor and profit. From their view, it was a profound, quiet grace, tiny pockets of warmth that kept the blood moving through the veins when the rest of the world was frozen solid. And that's what's so chilling.
The years accumulate, not in grand sweeping milestones, but in a slow, relentless layering of frost on brick. The working life of the knocker-up gathers its toll in microscopic increments, written directly into the cartilage and the bone. The long bamboo pole, gripped tightly for thousands of hours in the freezing dark, absorbs the sweat, the damp, and the desperate energy of the hands that carry it. The wood is polished completely smooth by sheer, unyielding repetition, stained dark by the coal dust that coats the city. The root itself becomes a physical groove worn deep into the mind of the waker. It is 1,000,000 steps taken on wet Yorkstone. It is 10,000 copper coins lifted from freezing sills in the dead of winter. Over decades, the cold ceases to be an external weather event and becomes a permanent, heavy condition of the body. The joints swell and lock, the lungs rattle with the permanent damp of the alleys. For an entire lifetime, the waker has moved through the unlit, unpaved back streets, a necessary vertical ghost tethered entirely to the brutal demands of the factory whistle. They have been the absolute, unquestioned arbiter of the morning, holding the economic survival of 100 families in the deep pockets of their heavy wool coat. But the era of the human clock was never destined to last. The trade does not end with a sudden, violent rupture. There is no grand ceremony on the cobblestones. There is no sweeping parliamentary legislation outlawing the bamboo pole. No town hall proclamation thanking the knocker-ups for their decades of frozen service. No tearful farewells exchanged through the cracked, dirty glass of the terrace windows. The end of the knocker-up is deeply, profoundly undramatic. It simply thins. It fades away, house by house, street by street, copper penny by copper penny, erased entirely by the slow, inexorable crawl of mass manufacturing. It is an obsolescence dictated entirely by cold economics rather than human sentiment. The knocker-up is replaced because the industrial machine that required their existence finally learns how to stamp out a cheaper metallic substitute. The agent of this quiet destruction is small, cold, and entirely devoid of blood. In the final decades of the 19th century and accelerating rapidly through the early decades of the 20th, the price of a spring-driven mechanical alarm clock begins to plummet. What was once an intricate, expensive luxury of polished brass and heavy mahogany, reserved strictly for the heated parlors of the middle class, is violently miniaturized. It is redesigned for the working poor, stamped from cheap tin, and assembled by the thousands in vast, deafening factories. It arrives in the cramped, damp bedrooms of the industrial terrace, a small, round, loudly ticking device with a stiff brass winding key on the back and harsh, metallic double bell mounted on the top. It costs perhaps a few shillings, the equivalent of several months' pay to the knocker-up, but to the mill worker it is a permanent, one-time investment that will eventually pay itself.
Imagine the profound, quiet shift inside the worker's home. Consider a weaver who is paid 2 pence a week every week for 20 years to the shadow standing in the street. They bring the cheap tin clock home, set it squarely on the dusty, ash-stained mantelpiece, and wind the tight steel spring with their thumb and forefinger. They draw the heavy lace curtain shut against the night. They do not have to leave a precious copper coin out on the freezing stone sill. They do not have to lie in the shallow, paranoid depths of sleep, waiting anxiously for the sharp, localized scratch of wire on the glass. The heavy, terrifying anxiety of the morning is transferred entirely from the frozen figure in the alleyway to the tightly coiled spring inside the tin casing. The clock does not feel the freezing rain. The clock does not catch a chest cold in November. The clock does not require a weekly wage. It simply sits in the dry dark, ticking loudly, completely indifferent to the weather outside, until the mechanical hammer strikes the bell. For the worker, it is an incredible, miraculous liberation from the weekly 2 pence tax. For the waker, it is the absolute destruction of their livelihood. In the long dark before the whistle, she belongs to the root, not the house, but the root is vanishing beneath her feet. As the cheap clocks proliferate across the mantelpieces of the slum, the nature of the last rounds changes completely. The densely packed, highly efficient territories begin to fracture and dissolve.
Where a knocker-up once commanded a solid, unbroken row of 80 houses, moving efficiently from door to door, they now find themselves walking past 20 entirely silent, darkened windows just to reach one remaining stubborn client. The geography of the route expands, but the ledger violently contracts. The waker must walk 3 times as far, pushing their aching, arthritic joints through the freezing mist, just to earn a fraction of their former wage. The work becomes an exercise in sheer, desperate futility. Because the trade is dying, the young do not enter it. The invisible real estate of the route is no longer sold or passed down to the next generation. The figures holding the bamboo poles and the pea shooters in these twilight years are the elderly, the widowed, the stubbornly resilient edge workers who have absolutely no other means of making a copper penny in the dark. They are the final generation of the human clock, walking an emptying board, tapping on the few panes of glass that have not yet surrendered to the tin machine. Yet the trade persists far longer than one might reasonably expect. The human clock does not vanish overnight in a neat historical timeline. Old habits, deeply ingrained in the architecture of the working class, die with profound stubbornness. In the tight-knit, sprawling mill towns of Lancashire and Yorkshire, the knocker-up remains a documented, visible presence well into the modern era.
It is a verified fact of the regional press and local archives that some knocker-uppers continued walking the dark right through the first half of the 20th century. Their long bamboo poles tapped softly on the glass during the terrifying blackouts of the Second World War, moving through streets where not a single crack of light was permitted to shine. There are heavily attested records, supported by press photographs and local journalism, of women and men in northern England still performing the trade into the late 1940s, and in rare, isolated pockets even into the early 1950s. They became living anachronisms, local curiosities documented by newspaper reporters who recognized that they were witnessing the very last echoes of the Victorian age. In these final, fading days, the irony of their existence is finally captured. The trade that operated entirely in the dark, that built a vast economy on being unseen, is suddenly pulled into the light of the flashbulb and the printing press. Tap. Still. Name. The photographers come to the wet streets of the north. They point their lenses at the elderly men in flat caps holding fishing rods up to the high windows. They take pictures of the older women wrapped in heavy shawls, raising their pea shooters to their lips. The names are carefully written down in the reporter's notebook. Mary Smith, Mrs. Waters, Mr. Nelson. The individuals who stood as the final anchors of the trade are recorded in the ink of the local broadsheets. It is here, at the absolute end of the line, that the central tragedy of the waker is quietly reversed. She wakes the world to work, and the world wakes without her name. For decades, this was the blunt, unforgiving truth of the cobblestones. The worker rushed past the knocker-up in the gray dawn without a glance. The neighborhood utilized her body until it broke, and then forgot her when the tin clock arrived. The street offered no loyalty and no memory. But as the trade finally breathes its last, the historical record steps in to perform a quiet, entirely unexpected mercy. The city forgot her, but the archive keeps her. The ledger of the press captures the image of the heavy coat, the cold stone, and the raised pole. The names that were never spoken by the people they saved are meticulously preserved in the black ink of the newspaper columns and the parish registers. They are caught and held, entirely safe from the freezing rain and the locked iron gates. The long night is finally over. The mechanical clock has conquered the mantelpiece. The factory whistle still blows across the wet slate roofs, but the street below is completely empty. The bamboo poles are brought inside, leaned against the brickwork of a dark hallway, and left to gather dust. The heavy, wet boots are unlaced and put away. The joints can finally stop moving. The lungs can finally stop drawing in the freezing, toxic mist. The waker, who spent a lifetime dragging the rest of the world out of its slumber, is finally granted permission to close their own eyes. The terraced house is quiet. The fire's banked. The heavy wooden door is locked from the inside. Let the image of the freezing street slowly dissolve into the deep, settling quiet of the archive. The cold stone fades. The stinging sleet vanishes. The desperate, terrifying anxiety of the morning shift is gone, replaced entirely by the still, calm silence of the photograph. The figures who carried the burden of the dark are resting perfectly still. The town sleeps, and the wakers sleep with it. From today's view, it's the strange comfort that the printed record kept what the unfeeling street didn't. Proof that the massive, roaring industrial city ran entirely on the quiet grace of invisible hands. From their view, it was merely a practical arrangement the city desperately relied on and never formally acknowledged. A brutal, freezing service that ended not with a warm thank you, but with a cheaper tin machine. And that's what's so chilling.
The transition from the freezing, chaotic damp of the 19th century industrial street to the modern day is incredibly quiet. It is the year 2026, and the heavy, sulphurous fog of the northern mill towns has long since blown away, leaving behind a vastly different kind of silence. We are standing in the climate-controlled stillness of the People's History Museum in Manchester. The air in this room is perfectly regulated, stripped of all moisture and bitter chill, held at a constant protective 68 degrees. There is no wind rattling the window panes. There is no desperate clatter of wooden clogs on the pavement outside. There is only the soft, ambient, mechanical hum of the modern ventilation system, circulating clean, dry air over rows of heavy steel shelving. A gray, acid-free archival box is pulled slowly from a shelf. It slides out with a soft, muted friction against the enameled metal. A researcher, their hands covered in pristine white cotton gloves, carries the box to a large, flat wooden table bathed in the warm, even light of a heavy desk lamp. The lid is lifted. Inside, resting perfectly flat beneath a protective sheet of translucent tissue paper, is a silver gelatin photograph. Pole. Gone. Quiet. The image captured in the chemical emulsion of the paper is well over a century old. It shows a figure standing on a cobbled street, tightly wrapped in a heavy dark coat, holding a long bamboo pole that extends out of the frame. The face in the photograph is blurred slightly at the edges, a testament to the long exposure time required in the dim, watery light of an industrial dawn. She is looking slightly upward, forever paused in the act of preparing to strike a piece of glass that no longer exists on a terraced house that was likely demolished decades ago. There is a profound, almost heartbreaking gentleness in the way this object is treated today. The woman in the photograph spent her entire life being ignored by the very people she saved from ruin. She walked through a world that viewed her merely as a loud, irritating mechanism, an appliance to be paid in dirty copper coins and left out in the freezing rain. Now she is handled with the utmost reverence.
Her image is protected from the light, shielded from the damp, and catalogued with meticulous precision. She is finally safe from the cold.
When we look deeply at this surviving record, we can see the long, unbroken thread of the edgeworker weaving its way through the history of the hidden dark. The forms change, but the isolation remains. The heavy iron spade that once turned the damp earth of the churchyard has become the long bamboo pole that tapped the freezing pane. The slow, resonant bronze bell that tolled the passing of a soul has been replaced by the shrieking brass whistle that marked the start of the factory shift. The low stone wall of the parish boundary has transformed into the narrow masonry sill of the terraced house, and the heavy, unforgiving ground that held the dead has become the fragile, frosted glass that shielded the exhausted living. The edgeworker always stands on the boundary. They always carry the burden of the hours that polite society refuses to touch. But looking at the photograph in the quiet of the Manchester reading room, there is a deep, settling peace in knowing that her route is finally over. The massive iron gates of the textile mills have been torn down or converted into luxury apartments. The shift boards and the fine ledgers have turned to dust. The desperate, terrifying anxiety of the pre-dawn dark, where missing 5 minutes meant starving for a week, has faded into the soft, unthreatening glow of the silent digital clocks that rest on our bedside tables today. We wake ourselves now. The intricate machinery of the modern world no longer requires a shivering human being to walk miles over uneven stone to ensure the day begins. The bamboo poles have all been burned for firewood or lost to the cellars of history. The pea shooters are gone. The vast, invisible ledger of 100 names and 100 windows, held entirely in the mind of an exhausted woman, has finally been allowed to close. Glass, dark, breath. The archivist carefully lowers the tissue paper back over the photograph, obscuring the heavy coat and the long pole beneath a veil of protective white. The lid is placed gently back onto the gray box. The box slides back onto the steel shelf, disappearing into the vast, silent catalog of the working past. The light on the wooden desk is switched off. The room settles entirely into the dark. The waker, who spent her entire life denying herself rest so that the rest of the empire could function, is finally permitted to sleep. From today's view, it is the strange, quiet comfort that the archive kept with the street so easily forgot. The profound irony that a life built entirely to wake the world left almost no footprint of its own. From their view, it was merely the dark street before the clock, existing only because someone agreed to stand in the freezing rain and be the clock, a desperate, practical arrangement that ended not with gratitude, but with a cheaper tin machine. And that's what's so chilling.